Welcome to week 11 of the story. It's the story of David. But as we begin, let me ask you, did you ever grow up hating pickup games for fear you'd be chosen last? Did you have a younger brother and sister who were always pushing your buttons saying they were better than you? Have you ever been promised something and told you'd have to wait to get it? Have you ever been really successful and had your boss get jealous at your success? Have you ever seen someone abuse power just because they could? Have you ever been confronted with a wrongdoing and then have to ask for forgiveness, to confess? Well, welcome to the life of David, the shepherd boy who became king of Israel. In the story this week, we come to the life of David, and we will look and see what his lower story teaches us about the upper story of God. Well, let's review David's story real quick. You remember King Saul was king, but he was found unfaithful by God and was to be replaced. The Lord sent Samuel, the judge, the prophet, to the house of Jesse to choose one of his sons to be king. Now, Jesse has 8 sons, but he only brings 7 in, and he presents them each one to Saul, from oldest and on down that way. And at each one, God tells Saul, not this one, not this one, not this one, not this one. He gets down to where he's been through all 7 and not one of them, and Samuel finally looks at Jesse and says, don't you have any more sons? And he said, well, I have one, the younger, the runt. David was the youngest. Wasn't even worthy in Jesse's eyes of being brought in for this choice. He's out in the fields, Jesse says, tending sheep. Most likely, David spent his days setting up clay pots and taking target practice with his sling. But Jesse sends for David, and the Lord then tells Samuel, this is the one, anoint him as king. Now, this would be a future king because Saul was still alive and acting as king. Because he was anointed king did not mean that David was immediately made king. The scripture says that the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul and was powerful in David. Now Saul was troubled by an evil spirit. He summoned David to come and soothe his spirit by playing the harp. David found favor and was loved by Saul. Now in this time, David goes back and forth between serving the king and watching his father's sheep. The Israelites are in battle with the Philistines, and the Philistine champion has been challenging the Israelites for 40 days. You remember the story. The Israelites have cowered in fear, and then one day David's father sends him to check on his brothers who are there at the battlefield, at the battlefront. You know the story well. It's called David and Goliath. David volunteers to fight Goliath. His brothers are irritated by his brashness. Saul sends David to fight, and David kills Goliath. After that, David has more success. And the people begin to sing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. Saul becomes insanely jealous, seeks to kill David. Saul knows that the Lord is with David and not with him. And the rest of 1 Samuel reads like a chase scene of a spaghetti western. Saul chases David all over in order to capture and to kill him. Now David has many opportunities to kill Saul, to take the throne that was promised to him. But he refuses to harm Saul, who David called the Lord's anointed. Now if you rush ahead in the story, Saul kills himself in a battle, and David is finally anointed as king in Judah. David continues to have success in battle and expands the size of Israel. Now, in an abuse of power, David one night sees Bathsheba taking a bath, and he sends for her. She's Uriah's wife. Their adultery ends in a pregnancy. David's solution is to call Uriah back from the battlefront, have him sleep with his wife, and then no one would ever know. But Uriah refuses. He says, I can't do that when my brothers are out on the battlefield. And so David sends him back to the battlefield with an order to put him at the very front of the fiercest battle and then draw back from him so he'll be killed. Nathan, sometime later, comes and confronts David with his sin. David repents, asks for forgiveness. We'll look at that more in the weeks to come. God promises to establish David's throne for eternity, and David wants to build a temple to God. But God says it will be done by one of David's sons, but not by David. Now, if we see the Lord at work here in this story, I want you to see that first, God saw in David what others did not see. Jesse didn't even think to have David present when he presented his sons to Samuel. His brothers saw him as a brat, scolded him when he came to the battlefield. Saul saw him only as a boy and not able to fight Goliath. And Goliath saw him as a weak pushover, a red-cheeked boy, he called him. But second, God saw in David all he wanted in a king. David's faithfulness in watching his father's sheep showed God David's courage and servant's heart. Remember, he had fought the bear and the lion in protecting his father's sheep. He was faithful. Now, third, David did not immediately become king. For 14 years, Saul chased David and tried to kill him. And I believe that God used that time to mold and shape David, to hone him into the person he needed him to be as king. God's power was with David. David conquered other nations and expanded the territory of Israel. Throughout his life, David experienced God's hand on him. And from David's lineage would come the Messiah. Now, when you look at the records of David's life, he records for us his encounters with the Lord in kind of what I would, almost like a journal. We call it Psalms. Now, not all the Psalms are his, but most are, and they describe a day-to-day walk with the Lord. That day-to-day includes his highs, his lows, his victories and defeats, his complaints and his praise. In the Psalms, we see every human emotion poured out before God. David, in these Psalms, chronicles his understanding of God's work and presence in his life, both at times when he sensed God's presence and when he wondered where God was and why he felt abandoned. So what are some of the lessons we can learn here from the upper story? First, God is at work even when others try to convince us he's not. See, many did not see David as God saw him. David listened to God's voice rather than to his detractors. We are to look for God's work in our lives. There are some things that hinder us in recognizing God's work in our daily life. First is being out of fellowship with God. Unconfessed sin forms kind of a cloud, prevents us from seeing God's work clearly in our lives. Secularism, having a worldview that's driven by the temporal rather than the eternal. Burnout. You do everything you are asked to do. You take every assignment, and one day you wake up and realize that you're physically, emotionally, and spiritually burned out. It can happen in your job. It can happen in your relationship. Burnout occurs when over an extended period of time, there's more output than input. Another is the fear of a hypocrisy. Some people are so insecure that they need to put God's name on everything they do, so others will be more likely to believe them. They credit with God with things I'm sure he wants no part of. Now, where can we look to see God at work? Well, first, an obvious answer to prayer. It may not be what we wanted, but it's an obvious answer to prayer. Second, unexpected evidence of God's care. Maybe out of the blue, someone said they prayed for you at a particular time, and it was right when you needed someone to pray for you. Unusual linkage or timing. You might discover that God stirred a person to pray. that unexpected experience of God's care. Help to do God's work in a world. Is it coincidence that God has people in this church, in this class, with gifts that allow us to do incredible ministry? In the lower story, many only saw a shepherd boy, where God in the upper story saw a king.